Adam doesn't say very much in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. God and the serpent do most of the talking, not necessarily in that order. When Adam does speak, he's answering God, who first asks, "Where are you?" Adam responds, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked." "Who told you that you were naked?" asks God. "Did you eat of the tree from which I had forbidden you to eat?" Adam now replies, "The woman you put at my side, she gave me of the tree, and I ate." And thus begins mansplaining, the tendency of men to explain things that a woman already knows and has often already said, perhaps in different words, and often in a way that is more favorable to the man. Admittedly, in this biblical example, Adam isn't speaking to Eve or for her, but to God. Still, he's mansplaining. God's earlier commandment not to eat the forbidden fruit comes before Eve is even created. Adam deflects wrongdoing for having eaten the fruit entirely onto the woman, and even seems to suggest that God is ultimately to blame, given that God created the woman who has tempted him to sin. A 12th century commentator, Rabbi Joseph ben Isaac Bechor Shor, argues that the true meaning about Adam's response is, "The iniquity is not upon me, but upon the serpent and the woman." Corinne Pertil has written that while the term mansplaining has been around only since 2008 and was first included in the Oxford English Dictionary a decade later, the concept is anything but new. She cites a handbook of etiquette for ladies and gentlemen, published in 1859. The man who makes too much of his particular excellencies, who attempts to engross conversation with the one topic he is strong in, or, being a great man in any line, puts himself forward, condescends, talks loudly, or asserts his privileges, is a vulgar man, be he king, Kaiser, or cobbler. Putrell notes that Emily Post attributed mansplaining to wealth, writing most of those thrown much into contact with millionaires will agree that an attitude of infallibility is typical of a fair majority. Post confined her critique to wealthy men. A contemporary take would be more expansive. The tendency to imagine that one has the most accurate information and a superior way of explaining it is associated with privilege. Whether privilege comes from wealth or race, religion or ethnicity, gender identity, or sexual orientation, members of the advantaged group will assume, consciously or otherwise, that they know better than members of the historically disadvantaged group. We learned this week, if we did not know previously, that Jews can be objects of other people's assumption about what we ought to think and do. In a newly released videotaped interview from 2021, former President Trump said that American Jews need to get their act together and support his particular version of pro-Israel policy, quote, "before it's too late." Apparently referring to a Jewish person off camera, the former president went on to ask, "Is this a good Jewish character right there?" ADL Chief Executive Officer Jonathan Greenblatt replied, "We don't need the former president to lecture us about U.S.-Israel relationship. It is not about quid pro quo. It rests on values and security interests. This Jew-splaining is insulting and disgusting." My point in offering this example is not to excoriate the former president. Instead, one might well ask of any non-Jew who presumes to know what views American Jews should espouse, what gives them the right to assume that they know better than American Jews how we might best support Israel? What positions them to define a good Jewish character? The answer, of course, is privilege, the same right that has led men to speak for women white Americans to characterize people of color, straight people to stereotyped gay, lesbian, and transgender and gender nonconforming individuals, able-bodied people to think they know better than those with disabilities, and Europeans, and occasionally European Americans, to imagine that they know so well what was best for Africans, Asians, and South Americans, and Caribbean people, that they should colonize their lands and control their destinies. A few years ago, at a Central Council of American Rabbis board meeting, Rachel, a woman on the board, made an important point. Immediately thereafter, a man, Peter, made virtually the identical point, albeit in his own words. Almost as soon as he finished, though, we could all see Peter's double take. He asked, "I just mansplained Rachel, didn't I?" Rachel responded affirmatively, if graciously. Peter was chagrined and apologetic. I was chagrined too. You see, I hadn't noticed that Peter had said almost exactly what Rachel already had. And I had to ask myself, how often have I done what Peter just did? The answer, I suspect, is countless times. I could argue that the term mansplaining was not coined until I was over 40, and I did not have a clear understanding of the concept and how it might apply to me until that 2018 board meeting. Still, mansplaining was never okay, whether we knew to call it that or not, but avoiding a long-established habit is hard. One of my tactics is to seek advice from a trusted woman. For example, I might agree with a woman's answer to a question in our Reform Rabbis Facebook group, but consider it to be missing specifics that might be particularly helpful to the questioner. If I know the female colleague who has answered similarly to how I would, I reach out to her and ask, would I be mansplaining if I said that I agree with what you said and want to add a specific method for accomplishing it? Then I'll only post my answer to the group if she suggests that I do so. In other words, I treat myself as a privileged man who's only beginning to learn about the concept and is only newly able to apply it to myself. I need guidance to prevent me from mansplaining. We often teach and learn that Mi Chamocha, the song at the sea, extolling God for freeing the children of Israel from bondage, was originally expounded by Miriam. Reading the Torah, though, we first come across those words as sung by Moses and the Israelites. Only after the whole poem is recorded, we see Miriam the prophet, Aaron's sister, picked up a hand drum, and all the women went out after her and danced with hand drums, and Miriam chanted for them. An established principle of Torah interpretation is that just because something is written first in the Torah does not mean that it happened first, unless the Torah explicitly says so. The man who wrote down the Torah, though, chose to write those powerful words first in Moses' voice and only then in Miriam's. In song, and in our contemporary telling of the story, we are attempting to remedy that, in this case overcompensating out of necessity, placing the words only in Miriam's voice to assure that the voice of women is heard. Until we reach a time when people of less privilege are granted the same voice as those who have historically been denied their voice. That is, until mansplaining, Jew-splaining, and all other kinds of condescending speaking for others are vanquished. Let us assure that we hear the voices of women, the voices of people of color, the voices of gay, lesbian, and queer people, and the voices of those who are disabled. Indeed, the voices of all who have been silenced, or at least discounted, since the days of Adam and Eve.